Jaden Thomas had the world at his fingertips. A private jet waiting on the runway, a wardrobe that could rival a celebrity's, and a family name that could open any door. Before he even knocked. But none of it mattered. Beneath the sleek suits and polished shoes, Jaden was falling apart. His grades? A joke. His purpose? Non-existent. Despite all the wealth and privilege, he couldn't seem to pass a single test. Before we dive into this amazing story, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and comment below telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. It wasn't just the classes he failed. Jaden's life felt like an exam he was bound to fail. Teachers gave up on him. His classmates watched from the sidelines, some in envy, others in disgust. And his father, Marcus Thomas, the self-made billionaire, had long stopped believing in him. Jaden was the son of a tech mogul, whose name was synonymous with power. But to his father, he was nothing but a disappointment. Then, one morning, in the quietest corner of the mansion, Marisol, the maid no one paid much attention to, offered him a secret that would change everything. While she scrubbed the floors, she whispered, "True success isn't in what you have, Jaden. It's in who you become." He thought she was just cleaning, but what she said would clean out everything he thought he knew about success. Jaden had everything money could buy, but one thing was missing: purpose. At 17, he was enrolled in one of the most prestigious schools in the country, not because he earned his spot, but because his last name had opened the doors for him. But inside those marble walls lined with portraits of influential people, Jaden was known for three things: his arrogance, his expensive clothes, and his inability to pass even the easiest tests. What was the point of grades when your name already guaranteed success? But in one simple conversation with someone who had nothing, Jaden would finally understand. It wasn't his name that would shape his future. It was what he did with it. Jaden had lived a life of excess. His father's empire had created a world where nothing was out of reach. But for all that his wealth offered, it never filled the void that lingered inside him. Now, as he walked the halls of his elite high school, the weight of his failures was starting to crush him. Jaden had lived a life of excess. His father's empire had created a world where nothing was out of reach. But for all that his wealth offered, it never filled the void that lingered inside him. Now, as he walked the halls of his elite high school, the weight of his failures was starting to crush him. His arrogance, once his armor, now felt like a burden, and every classroom he entered became a battlefield where he was destined to lose. His latest math exam had returned with a bright red F stamped across the top. A solitary number in the margin, 45%. The number meant nothing. He could already hear his father's voice echoing in his mind. "You're wasting your time, Jaden. Wasting my money." But it wasn't just the money. It was the disappointment. That look on his father's face whenever Jaden failed to live up to the expectations that came with the Thomas name. Jaden had failed again. But what did it matter? In his father's eyes, he was already a failure. He slumped in his chair in the school's quiet, empty library, absently flipping through a book he'd been assigned to read for history class. The words blurred together. Too boring, too dry to hold his attention. He hadn't even opened the book for more than 10 minutes before he tossed it aside, his gaze drifting to the ceiling. Every test, every quiz, every lecture seemed like a waste of time. What was the point? The world already knew who his father was. One day the Thomas name would be his to carry. A good GPA wouldn't make a difference. But deep down, Jaden knew he was lying to himself. The emptiness inside gnawed at him, no matter how much money or power surrounded him. wasn't even sure who he was anymore. As he picked at his phone, scrolling through social media with no real interest, a pair of teachers passed by, whispering about him behind his back. "Did you hear? Jaden's failed the last 3 tests. His father's going to pull him out of here soon." "Maybe that's for the best," another teacher muttered. "What's the point of keeping him here if he's not even trying?" Jaden's fingers tightened around his phone, anger bubbling up. They didn't know him. They didn't understand. He didn't care about the tests. They meant nothing. What they didn't see was the pressure he faced every day from his father. He was expected to be perfect, expected to succeed, and yet nothing he did was ever good enough. With a sharp exhale, Jaden shoved the phone into his pocket and stood up, walking toward the exit. He was done with this. He didn't need to sit through another boring class, pretending to care about anything. The truth was, nothing seemed to matter anymore. That evening, when Jaden returned to the mansion, the familiar sights of wealth and opulence surrounded him. His father's mansion, furnished in grand, sprawling rooms with crystal chandeliers and marble floors, felt more like a gilded cage than a home. His father had bought him every toy, every gadget, every expensive piece of clothing, but none of it made him feel whole. Marcus Thomas sat in the grand study, his back straight, his expression hard. He was always hard, his face set in a permanent frown as he scanned over business documents. The weight of expectation in that room was palpable. "Jaden," his father said without looking up, "we need to talk." Jaden's heart sank. He knew what was coming. Another lecture, another set of rules he had to follow, more criticisms aimed at how he had failed yet again. "What is it, Dad?" Jaden asked, his voice flat as he leaned against the doorframe. "Your grades," Marcus said, finally looking up from his papers. "Your history exam, F. Your math exam, another F. You're a joke, Jaden." Jaden's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The last thing he wanted was to argue. He was tired of hearing his father's voice, tired of hearing about what a disappointment he was. It didn't matter what he did, it would never be enough. "If you worked for me," Marcus continued, "I'd fire you by now. This is the last time I'm going to tell you to shape up. If you don't get your act together, I'm pulling you from that school. You'll go to a regular college, and we'll see what you can do without the world handing you everything on a silver platter." Jaden just stared at him, his heart pounding in his chest. But what could he say? He wasn't good enough. It didn't matter how much money he had, how much influence his father wielded. He was never going to be what Marcus wanted. "Fine," Jaden muttered, turning on his heel. "I'm going out." "Where?" Marcus's voice was hard, but Jaden didn't turn around. "Just out," he replied, slamming the door behind him. Jaden didn't know where he was going. He just needed to get away from the house, away from the weight of his father's expectations, away from the overwhelming silence that seemed to swallow him up. The cool night air brushed against his skin as he walked aimlessly through the streets, his thoughts a mess of frustration. He needed something, anything, to distract him from the crushing feeling in his chest. And then, as he wandered down the quiet halls of his mansion, he heard it. It wasn't much, just a soft murmur. The sound of Marisol, the maid, cleaning the hallway by the side door. Jaden had never really paid attention to her. To him, she was just the woman who came and went, cleaning up after everyone, with no real significance in his life. But this time, as he passed by her, something caught his ear. "Success isn't what you have, Jaden," she said softly, her voice low and calm. "It's who you become." Jaden stopped in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. Had she just spoken to him? The words had an almost poetic quality, something deeper than anything he had heard in a long time. He glanced over his shoulder, but she was too busy polishing the floor to notice him. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Marisol looked up from her work, meeting his gaze with an unblinking calm. Her eyes were steady, her expression unreadable. "Nothing you're ready to understand, boy," she replied softly, turning back to her task as if nothing had happened. Jaden stood frozen for a moment, his thoughts whirling. Success? Who you become? What was she talking about? He didn't have time for vague advice from someone who had no idea what it was like to live his life. To her, he was just another rich kid who took everything for granted. She wouldn't understand the pressure, the expectations. But something about her words lingered in his mind, gnawing at him. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the way she said them. There was a quiet authority in her voice, a kind of wisdom he hadn't expected. As he walked away, his mind kept returning to her words. Success isn't what you have. It's who you become. Jaden didn't know it yet, but that small, quiet moment in the hallway would be the beginning of a transformation he never saw coming. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he understood about life, success, and the world beyond his father's money. Maybe there was more to learn. Maybe he hadn't figured it all out yet. And for the first time in a long while, Jaden felt a flicker of curiosity. Maybe Marisol, the maid, knew something he didn't. And maybe, just maybe, that one piece of advice was the key to unlocking the person he was supposed to become. Jaden's life was a storm of defiance, and every day seemed to bring another battle with the forces he couldn't escape. His father's expectations, the oppressive weight of privilege, and the harsh truth that he was failing. But the hardest part wasn't the exams he kept flunking or the teachers who passed him out of fear. It was the growing emptiness inside him, the sense that he wasn't who he was supposed to be, and yet he couldn't find a way out of it. It had been weeks since Marisol had spoken those cryptic words to him in the hallway, but they stuck with him. He couldn't stop thinking about them. Success isn't what you have, Jaden. It's who you become. Who did he even want to become? And why did it seem like everyone around him had given up on him? That night, after yet another failed round of exams, each paper marked with harsh red ink and cold comments, Jaden threw himself onto his bed in frustration. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, but he ignored it, his mind drowning in a sea of anger and confusion. His father had been right. Every failure, every poor grade, was another strike against him. "You're wasting my money, Jaden. Wasting my time." The thought of disappointing Marcus again was almost too much to bear. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered. His father's wealth, the inheritance that was supposed to define him, felt like a cage, and Jaden was suffocating in it. The next morning, the inevitable confrontation came. "Jaden, we need to talk." It wasn't a question. It was a command. Jaden walked into his father's study, knowing exactly what was coming. The walls of the grand office, lined with bookshelves and expensive artwork, seemed to close in on him. Marcus Thomas was seated at the head of the massive oak desk, his stern eyes studying the papers before him, as if his son wasn't even in the room. "What is it, Dad?" Jaden's voice was flat, his body tense with the familiar dread that always followed these meetings. Marcus didn't look up. "Another F in history, and a D in math. This is your 4th fail in a row, and your GPA is slipping further. You're academically at risk, Jaden." Jaden folded his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "I don't care. It doesn't matter. You're the one who made me come here, remember? It's not like I need a diploma to inherit your company. Marcus's gaze shot up, his expression hardening. You think this is a joke? He slammed the papers down onto the desk. You're my son, Jaden, not some entitled kid waiting to coast on my name. You want to be a part of this family's legacy? Then you need to prove you can handle it. This isn't just about grades. It's about you stepping up. I'm giving you one more chance. Jaden's heart thudded in his chest. He had heard it before, the ultimatum, the threats, the guilt. But this time, something inside him snapped. Don't you get it, Dad? Jaden's voice rose. I don't want your legacy. I don't want your money. I don't want to be another piece in your empire. You think a good GPA is going to make me worthy of your name? Maybe I don't need to be worthy. Maybe I just need to be me. Marcus's face darkened, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. You want to be yourself? His voice was cold. Then you'll have to do it without me. Without the money, without the name, without the privileges. You're not getting another dime from me until you get your grades up. Prove to me you're not just another spoiled kid with a rich last name. Show me you can work for something. The words hit Jaden like a slap across the face. What's that supposed to mean? He asked, trying to steady his breath. You're cutting me off? I'm cutting you off, Marcus confirmed. Prove you can make something of yourself. Otherwise, I'll stop paying for your education. No car, no trust fund, no safety net. You'll live like anyone else. You want freedom? Fine. Earn it. Jaden clenched his fists, but said nothing. What could he say? He had no choice. His father had made it clear. This was the end of the line. The moment his father left for one of his many business meetings, Jaden slumped against the wall of the hallway. His body felt heavy, his mind whirling. The anger still burned inside him, but now there was a new fire, one he couldn't quite place. He wasn't sure where to go next, but something inside him was determined not to let his father win. He couldn't let Marcus define who he was. He refused to be that rich, empty, entitled kid forever. But he had no idea where to start, and that frightened him more than anything. Jaden had never been one to ask for help. But as the day dragged on, his frustration turned into desperation. He had always seen Marisol as just another servant, a quiet, unimportant figure who seemed to blend into the background of the mansion. But now, for the first time, he found himself searching for her. He found her in the side kitchen, wiping down the counters, humming softly to herself as she worked. Jaden stood in the doorway, unsure of what to say. Marisol, he finally muttered, causing her to look up in surprise. She wiped her hands on her apron and gave him a measured, calm look. Yes, Mr. Thomas? Call me Jaden, he said, feeling the weight of his own words. It was the first time he'd ever called her by anything but her title. Marisol nodded and said nothing. I don't know what to do, Jaden admitted. His voice wavered as he spoke. My father's threatening to cut me off. He wants me to get my grades up, or he's done with me. I don't even know why I care anymore. It feels like nothing I do will ever be good enough. Marisol studied him for a long moment before speaking, her voice low and calm. You're not here for the right reasons, Jaden. Jaden opened his mouth to protest, but stopped. She was right. He wasn't. He had been coasting on his father's name, relying on wealth and privilege to get by. But none of it had made him feel alive. None of it had given him purpose. Then what should I do? Jaden asked, desperation creeping into his voice. Marisol placed a hand on the counter and leaned forward slightly. I'll teach you, she said simply, without hesitation. Jaden blinked in disbelief. Teach me? What could you possibly teach me? I'll teach you what it means to earn something for yourself, she replied softly. But there's a condition. You leave your name and pride at the door. You start from zero, like you're nothing. The words hit him like a punch, but they also felt like a challenge he couldn't ignore. He didn't know why, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had something to fight for. Deal, Jaden said, his voice steady, his resolve hardening. Teach me. Jaden had reached his breaking point. His rebellion, his anger, his frustration, he'd run out of places to direct them. But in that moment, something shifted. It wasn't just about trying to prove his father wrong anymore. It was about finding a new path, one that didn't rely on his last name, on his father's empire, or his inherited wealth. It was about proving to himself that he was capable of something more, something real. And for the first time, he felt ready to start. The following morning, Jaden walked into the old kitchen of his family's mansion with a mix of apprehension and defiance. The large marble countertops gleamed under the soft overhead lights, the smell of fresh coffee wafting in the air. This wasn't the first time he had stepped into this space, but it felt different now. He was here for something that felt, for the first time, like it could actually matter. Marisol was at the far side of the room, humming softly as she scrubbed a pan. She didn't look up as he entered, which annoyed Jaden more than he was willing to admit. He had expected something, maybe a little more enthusiasm from her, or at least some acknowledgement that this was different. But there was none of that. No fanfare, no congratulations, just the quiet rhythm of her cleaning. Marisol, he said, his voice sounding harsher than he intended. She paused, turning to face him with a steady gaze. You're here early. I didn't know what to expect, Jaden said, shuffling his feet awkwardly. So, this is it? This is how it starts? She set the pan down, wiping her hands on her apron before walking over to him. This is where it starts, she said simply. But it won't be what you think. He blinked, still unsure of what he was supposed to expect. He had imagined some kind of grand lesson, a transformative moment that would change everything. But so far, it felt like the same old routine. No tutors, no fancy textbooks, just a woman in an apron who had agreed to teach him. Well, what do we do now? Jaden asked, his tone betraying his frustration. You start from zero, Marisol replied, her voice calm but firm. You leave your name, your wealth, your pride at the door. You're not Jaden Thomas, the billionaire's son. You're just Jaden, a person with a mind ready to learn. Jaden frowned, not fully understanding what she meant. His mind buzzed with 1,000 questions, but he stayed quiet, hoping she'd give him more to work with. Sit. She gestured toward the old wooden chair beside the kitchen table. Jaden sat down, his posture rigid. He had expected something more hands-on, but Marisol didn't move to give him an assignment. Instead, she leaned against the counter, folding her arms and studying him intently. I'll teach you something important today, she said, her tone soft yet full of conviction. But it won't be what you're used to. Jaden was about to protest when she held up her hand. It's about humility, Jaden. Learning begins with humility. Jaden's eyes narrowed. He wasn't here for a lesson in humility. He had no patience for that kind of thing. But he didn't want to back out either. This was his last chance to prove to his father that he could be more than just a spoiled kid. So, he sat in silence, waiting for her to continue. Marisol didn't rush. She simply waited, letting the silence stretch between them. It was strange, uncomfortable. He wasn't used to feeling this way, like the center of attention was being withheld from him. Finally, she spoke again. Humility isn't about putting yourself down. It's about understanding your place in the world, knowing that you have room to grow. It's about knowing that you don't know everything. Jaden wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her that he didn't need to be taught humility. He had everything anyone could want. His life was proof of success. He wasn't the one who needed a lesson. But something about her tone, the quiet wisdom in her words, made him pause. She continued, as though reading his mind. Humility isn't weakness, Jaden. It's the strength to learn, to face your flaws head on and to grow despite them. Jaden stared at the floor, unwilling to meet her gaze. I don't see how that's going to help me pass my exams, he muttered, his voice betraying his frustration. I just need to do better in school. Why should I care about all this philosophy stuff? Marisol raised an eyebrow, her calm demeanor never wavering. Because your failure isn't about the exams, Jaden. It's about you. Jaden's jaw tightened. He hated hearing the truth in her words, especially when he wasn't ready to face it. But she wasn't backing down. You don't see the bigger picture yet, she continued. You've been running from yourself, from the things that scare you. And that's why you're failing. Jaden wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her that he didn't need to face anything, that his wealth and privilege would always carry him through. But for the first time, something inside him hesitated. Was she right? Was there more to this than just doing better on a math test or improving his grades? A few days later, Jaden received the results of his most recent math test. The numbers on the paper were even worse than he had expected, 35%. It was a humiliating failure, a number that screamed he hadn't even bothered to try. He stared at the paper in disbelief, the words of his father echoing in his head. Get your grades up or you'll be cut off. But this time, the shame he usually felt when he failed wasn't there. Instead, a strange sense of confusion washed over him. What was happening to him? He should have been angry, upset. But for some reason, all he felt was a deep, uncomfortable realization. He didn't know how to deal with this. As if on cue, Marisol appeared at the door of the study. She must have seen his reaction to the test. You're angry, she said, her voice gentle but knowing. Angry at yourself. But that anger won't help you learn. Jaden clenched his fists. What's the point of trying, Marisol? Every time I try, I fail. My father... He stopped himself before finishing the sentence, too embarrassed to voice the truth. Your father's opinion doesn't define you, Jaden, she interrupted softly. Failure is a part of learning. You're allowed to fail. But you can't let that failure define you. You need to understand why you failed. I don't care why, he said, his voice tight with frustration. I just want to pass. I want it to stop hurting. Marisol didn't answer right away. She stood still, letting the silence fill the room. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke again. Then maybe it's time to stop avoiding failure and start embracing it. Failure isn't the end. It's a teacher. It's where you learn the most. But you have to let go of your pride first. You have to be willing to face the truth about yourself. Jaden's chest tightened. The words stung, but they weren't false. He knew that. But admitting it, truly facing it, felt impossible. Marisol leaned in, her eyes locking with his. Your pride is stopping you from growing. It's time to put it aside. The next few days were a blur of self-reflection. Jaden continued to struggle with the lessons Marisol was giving him. She had him read philosophical texts, journal about his thoughts, and even explore emotional intelligence exercises. It was uncomfortable. It didn't feel like the quick fixes he had been hoping for. But with each lesson, each uncomfortable moment, Jaden began to see the cracks in the armor of his pride. He wasn't sure where this journey was taking him, but he couldn't deny that something was shifting inside him. The arrogance that had once shielded him was slowly crumbling, and for the first time, he felt the weight of his own limitations. The anger was still there, the resentment too. But now, there was something else, a flicker of hope, something that told him this wasn't the end of the road. It was the beginning. Jaden wasn't sure what he was becoming yet, but he was starting to realize that the journey ahead was more important than the destination. Jaden sat at his desk late into the evening, his eyes bloodshot from hours of reading and writing. The books Marisol had given him, philosophical texts, psychological studies, even novels about the human condition, had become more than just academic tasks. They were windows into a world he hadn't known existed, a world beyond wealth, beyond power, beyond the suffocating expectations of his father. It had been weeks since he'd started working with Marisol, and while his progress hadn't been meteoric, he could feel the slow but undeniable change taking place within him. His pride, once his armor, was beginning to crack, and in its place, a kind of quiet humility was taking root. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of resistance, moments where he wanted to walk away. But every time he felt that pull, he would remember Marisol's words. Success isn't what you have, Jaden. It's who you become. For the first time, those words didn't feel like a distant ideal. They felt real. He wanted to become someone. Not because of his father's wealth, not because of the Thomas name, but because of who he was deep down. But the journey wasn't simple, and Jaden knew it. He had miles to go before he could truly shed the arrogance that had ruled his life. The next day, Jaden sat in his history class, staring at the paper he had just turned in. The assignment was supposed to be a simple essay about the civil rights movement, but it had felt like more than that. For the first time in a long time, he had written something not for a grade, but for himself. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, and Jaden gathered his things slowly. He had made progress. His grades were still nowhere near where they needed to be, but there was improvement. That was something. It was all he could ask for right now. As he walked to his locker, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride. Not the inflated kind that came with his last name, but the quiet, steady kind that came from hard work and growth. He was learning. Not just about history or literature, but about himself. The following day, Jaden received his paper back during history class. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him as he opened the envelope. For a split second, he felt that familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. What if it was a failure? What if his effort hadn't been enough? But when he looked at the paper, his heart skipped a beat. The words, well written, insightful, and thoughtful. Ah, were written at the top in bold red ink. Jaden blinked, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. An A. Was this really happening? His gaze flicked to the side, where his classmates were talking in low voices. He could hear Josh's unmistakable chuckle, and a few of his friends murmured in disbelief. But Jaden couldn't help the small smile that tugged at his lips. For once, it wasn't the grade that mattered most. It was the fact that he had done it. He had written something worth reading, something that had made his teacher take notice. But of course, the moment of victory was fleeting. As Jaden gathered his things and headed toward the door, Josh made sure to get in a parting shot. "So, what's this?" Josh called out from across the room. "Jaden Thomas, the failure, turning in something that actually gets a decent grade? What next? You going to start studying like a real student?" Jaden's first instinct was to react, to snap, to throw a sarcastic comment back at Josh. He had done it 1,000 times before. But this time, something stopped him. He remembered Marisol's voice, calm and measured. Humility isn't about putting yourself down. It's about understanding your place in the world. Instead of firing back, Jaden simply turned and walked out of the room, ignoring Josh's mocking laughter behind him. It was hard, and every part of him wanted to shout something back. But for the first time in his life, he understood that walking away was a victory in itself. That evening, after another long day of classes and more studying with Marisol, Jaden found himself sitting in his father's study once again. Marcus Thomas was already there, as usual, hunched over his laptop, his face set in a stern frown. Jaden stood at the doorway for a moment, watching him before stepping inside. "Dad," Jaden said, his voice more confident than he'd felt in a long time. "We need to talk." Marcus didn't look up. "About what?" Jaden closed the door behind him, the sound of it echoing in the empty room. "About me." Finally, Marcus glanced up, his eyebrow raised in skepticism. "What's this about?" "I've been thinking," Jaden began, taking a deep breath. "And I don't want to follow your path anymore. I don't want to just live off the family name and fortune. I want to figure out who I am without it." The words felt like a weight had been lifted from his chest, and the look on his father's face was pure disbelief. Jaden had expected anger or disappointment or even mockery. But what he got instead was silence. "I don't want to be just another rich kid with a trust fund and a last name, Dad," Jaden continued, his voice growing steadier. "I want to build something for myself. I want to learn. I want to grow. I don't need your empire to do it. I don't need your money. I need my own path." Marcus's face was a mask, unreadable. But Jaden could see the subtle shift in his father's posture, the tightening of his jaw, the slight flare of his nostrils. "You're making a huge mistake," Marcus finally said, his voice low and sharp. "You think you can just throw away everything I've built for you? The opportunities, the legacy? You think it's all worthless?" Jaden met his father's gaze without flinching. "I think it's time for me to stop pretending that it's my life. I need to find my own way, Dad. I'm not you." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Jaden wasn't sure what would come next, but he knew he had crossed a line, one he could never go back from. Marcus finally broke the silence. "So that's it? You're done with everything I've worked for?" Jaden nodded slowly. "Yes, I'm done. I'm ready to figure out who I am, and I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for myself." Marcus stared at him for a long, tense moment, then stood up from his desk, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked past Jaden without a word, but before he left the room, he turned to face him. "You think this will make you stronger, son? You're wrong. You'll regret this." Jaden stood tall, his heart pounding in his chest. "Maybe, but at least I'll know I'm doing it for the right reasons." As Jaden stood alone in his father's study, He couldn't help but feel the weight of his decision. He had taken the first step towards something different, something real. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be obstacles. There always were. But for the first time in his life, Jaden felt like he was in control of his own destiny, and that, he realized, was worth more than any amount of money or legacy. He had chosen his own path, and for the first time, he was ready to walk it. Jaden sat at his desk, eyes scanning the pages of the book in front of him. It wasn't the usual dry textbook that filled his school bag, nor was it the pile of assignments that he used to scribble through just to get by. No, this was something entirely different. It was a piece of writing about social justice, a subject that had grabbed his attention over the past few weeks. Marisol had introduced him to the idea of finding his true passions, not those defined by his father's wealth or societal expectations. For the first time, Jaden found himself lost in the pages of something that didn't feel like an obligation, something that made him think about the world, about people, about his place in it. His fingers lingered on the words, pulling him into a realm that felt more real than any business class or high-end event he had ever attended. Weeks had passed since his confrontation with his father, and Jaden was beginning to notice the subtle changes in himself. Gone was the boy who lived for praise, for perfection, for outward success. In his place was someone eager to understand, to learn, and, most importantly, to grow. He still didn't have all the answers, and maybe he never would. But now, each day felt like a step forward in a direction he could believe in. And that direction wasn't driven by the need for a trust fund or a legacy. It was driven by curiosity, by self-discovery, and by the quiet power of self-compassion. One afternoon, as Jaden was leaving school, he bumped into a group of classmates he hadn't talked to much before. They were standing around by the lockers, chatting and laughing, but when they saw him, they gave him a nod. At first, Jaden felt awkward, unsure of what to say. His reputation was still something of a topic of conversation around school, and his shift in behavior had not gone unnoticed. But to his surprise, the conversation didn't feel forced. One of the girls, Priya, smiled at him. "Hey, Jaden, we're talking about that documentary on the civil rights movement. You should come watch it with us sometime. You're into that kind of stuff, right?" Jaden felt the instinct to brush her off, to retreat into his comfort zone of isolation. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the fact that he was tired of being alone, tired of pretending that the popularity of his last name meant anything to him anymore. So instead, he nodded. "Yeah, that sounds interesting. I'd like that." As the group moved toward the library, he walked with them. It felt strange to walk without the usual sense of being judged, without the heavy burden of his past self hanging around his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, Jaden wasn't trying to fit into the mold of someone he wasn't. He was simply being himself. And for the first time in his life, it felt like he belonged. That evening, as Jaden sat at the kitchen table, his father's voice came through from the other room. It was a constant in their house, even if Marcus didn't address him directly. "You're wasting your time, Jaden," Marcus said, his tone clipped. "I don't care how many books you read, or how much you learn about social justice. You don't think I've built this empire for you to throw it all away, do you?" Jaden, sitting at the table with his own thoughts, felt the familiar sting of anger rise within him. But instead of fighting back or becoming defensive, he simply took a deep breath. Marisol's words echoed in his mind. Success is about who you become. "I'm not throwing it away, Dad," Jaden said calmly, his voice steady. "I'm just choosing a different path. A path that makes sense to me." Marcus's footsteps came closer, and Jaden felt the old weight of his father's disappointment bearing down on him. "You'll never understand," Marcus said, his voice growing harder. "You can't throw away everything I've built. Do you think the world cares about your little social justice projects? No one cares. You'll end up just like all the others, lost with no purpose." Jaden's jaw clenched, but he didn't let the anger cloud his judgment. Instead, he stood up slowly, facing his father squarely. "Maybe I'm the one who's been lost, not you. But I'm not letting that happen anymore. I've found my purpose, and it's not about business or technology. It's about making a real difference in a way that matters. And I'm going to follow that path." His father didn't respond. The silence that followed was thicker than any argument. Jaden could feel the years of tension between them, the expectations his father had placed on him since he was a child. But for the first time, Jaden felt certain that he wasn't going to let those expectations define him. The next morning, Jaden sat down to write. It was no longer an assignment. This was something for himself. He had been given an opportunity to apply to a prestigious college that focused on social justice and education. He could almost hear his father's voice in his head, dismissing the idea with a scoff. But Jaden didn't care. This was his choice. As he wrote his application essay, the words flowed effortlessly. It wasn't about impressing the admissions committee or securing his future. It was about telling the truth, about finally owning who he was and what he wanted to do with his life. The application was simple, but it meant everything to him. It represented the first step in a new direction, one he was no longer afraid to take. When he finished, he sat back in his chair, looking out the window at the sprawling estate that had once felt like a prison to him. Now, it felt like a symbol of everything he wanted to break free from. It wasn't just about education. It was about giving people the tools they needed to change the world around them, just like he was beginning to do. For the first time, Jaden was thinking beyond himself. He was thinking about how his actions could help others, how they could inspire change. That afternoon, he went to visit Marisol, the woman who had taught him more than any book or tutor ever had. She was in the backyard, trimming the rose bushes, humming softly to herself. When she saw him approach, she smiled. "You're looking better," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I feel better," Jaden replied, sitting beside her on the wooden bench. "I've been thinking a lot. I applied to a college. Not the ones my father wanted me to, but one that makes sense to me." Marisol raised an eyebrow, impressed. "What's it for?" "It's focused on social justice and education," Jaden said. "I want to make a difference. Not just run a business or manage tech companies. I want to help people, really help them." Marisol nodded, her eyes twinkling with pride. "I'm proud of you, Jaden. I knew you'd find your way." He smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. "Thank you, Marisol. You've helped me see things differently. I didn't know where I was headed, but now I think I do." The moment hung between them, peaceful and serene, as Jaden realized that he was no longer walking alone. He had a purpose now, and it wasn't defined by wealth or expectations. It was something deeper, something more meaningful. As the days passed, Jaden continued on his journey. His relationship with his father remained strained, but it no longer consumed him. For the first time in his life, he was focused on the person he was becoming, not the person his father wanted him to be. And that was the first victory that really mattered. Jaden's heart was pounding in his chest as he stood at the threshold of his father's office. The soft hum of the mansion's air conditioning buzzed in the background, but in this moment, it felt deafening. The power in the room came from his father's towering presence, not the wealth that filled every corner of the estate. Marcus Thomas sat at his desk, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the polished surface, his sharp eyes fixed on the latest business reports that were always strewn about him. His empire, his pride, was laid out like an open book, and Jaden was no longer interested in reading from it. "Jaden," his father said without looking up, the tone as cold and uninviting as ever. "You're coming with me to the McCullen Group event tonight. This is important. We're presenting the new partnership proposal. Your presence is mandatory." Jaden stood there for a moment, the words hanging between them. For years, attending these events, playing the role of the dutiful son, had been his life. But now, the thought of standing in front of a room full of business tycoons, all of them expecting him to smile, shake hands, and show off his last name, filled him with a kind of suffocating dread. This was the last thing he wanted to do, the last thing he needed to do. "I'm not going," Jaden said, the words coming out more firmly than he had intended. He could feel the weight of the decision as soon as it left his lips. For the first time, he wasn't trying to please anyone. Marcus's eyes lifted from the papers. They were cold and calculating, studying Jaden like a problem that needed solving. "What did you say?" "I said I'm not going to that event," Jaden repeated, his voice resolute. "I don't want to be part of your world anymore. I'm not going to keep pretending to be something I'm not." A flicker of surprise crossed Marcus's face, but it quickly morphed into something darker. Disappointment, rage, perhaps even disbelief. "You think you can just walk away from everything I've built?" His voice was low, but the fury in it was unmistakable. "You think you can throw all of this away, this family, this legacy, just because you don't want to play by the rules anymore?" Jaden took a step forward, refusing to shrink under his father's glare. "Yes, I do. I'm done with living your life, Dad. I'm not you. I'm not going to spend my life making deals, cutting checks, and pretending I'm happy just because I have money." Marcus stood up suddenly, the movement sharp and forceful. "You will attend that event, Jaden, or you will have no place in this family, no place in this company, no place in my life." Jaden's pulse quickened, but his resolve didn't waver. "Then that's how it is, Dad. I won't be part of your world if it means giving up who I am. I'm not living for you anymore. I'm living for me." His father's face hardened, the veins in his neck standing out, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're making a huge mistake," Marcus said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You'll regret this. You can't just throw away everything I've built for you, Jaden. You're nothing without this name, without my fortune. Do you think you can do better without me? You think you're special? You're not. You're just another entitled kid who doesn't know the value of hard work." Jaden felt the sting of his father's words. But this time, it didn't break him. He had heard this speech too many times before. The constant reminders that without the Thomas name, he was nothing. But he was done being defined by that name. "I don't need your money, your name, or your legacy," Jaden said, his voice unwavering. "I've spent my whole life running from who I really am, trying to fit into a mold you made for me. But not anymore. I'm not going to let you dictate my future. I'm not going to spend my life in your shadow. I want something more than this. More than just a business deal." The silence in the room stretched like a taut wire, Marcus's face turned pale, his eyes narrowed into slits as he studied his son with a mix of disbelief and rage. "You want more?" Marcus's voice was cold now, laced with venom. "Fine. You want to walk away? You can. But you'll do it on your own. If you don't want this family, this company, this fortune, then you're cut off. Do you understand? I'm not going to support you anymore. You'll have nothing. Not a dime, not a home, not a future. You'll be nothing." Jaden's chest tightened, but he didn't flinch. He was ready for this. "I understand," he said quietly, looking his father square in the eye. "And I'm ready." Jaden walked out of the study and headed to his room, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety settle over him. His mind was a whirl of emotions, but one thought kept resurfacing. He was free. He had finally taken control of his life. But that freedom came at a cost. As he sat down at his desk, staring at the papers scattered in front of him, his application for college, his personal goals, his future, Jaden knew that he had made the right choice. No matter what, he wasn't going to let his father define him any longer. The days that followed were filled with tension. The house, which had always been a haven of luxury and convenience, now felt empty and suffocating. Jaden's relationship with his father had always been strained, but now it was officially broken. The silence between them was louder than any argument could ever be. Marcus had made good on his threat. Jaden's access to the family's wealth had been revoked. His credit cards were frozen, his bank accounts emptied. He was cut off, just like his father had promised. But for the first time, Jaden didn't feel scared. He felt liberated. A week later, Jaden found himself sitting at a small, bustling cafe, the smell of fresh coffee and baked goods surrounding him. The contrast to his father's world was stark, but Jaden couldn't help but feel a sense of peace as he sat there, working through his application essays, drafting plans for his future, and studying. His desk at home had never felt so empty. But here, surrounded by the hum of conversation and the soft clink of cups, he felt more himself than he ever had before. It was here, in this small cafe, that Jaden made his final decision. He would go forward with his plans, using his own savings to fund his education. Marisol had taught him about self-compassion, about understanding that he didn't need to be perfect, that failure was just a part of the process. He wasn't perfect, his grades weren't perfect, his future was uncertain. But that was okay. He was starting over, and this time he was doing it for himself. Jaden knew there was a long road ahead of him. There would be challenges, there always were. But for the first time, he was ready to face them. He didn't need his father's empire to succeed. He didn't need the wealth, the status, or the power. All he needed was his own belief in himself. And that was worth more than anything his father could ever give him. Jaden stood in front of the old brick building that housed his new college. The exterior was modest compared to the polished glass towers he had grown accustomed to. There were no grandiose steps leading up to the doors, no flashing billboards touting an illustrious alumni network. But for Jaden, it was the first step towards something real, something that belonged to him and only him. For the first time, he wasn't hiding behind his father's wealth, his family's name, or the legacy that had been forced upon him. He had no trust fund, no safety net, just a pile of student loans, a few odd jobs, and the willingness to begin again. The decision to enroll in this college had been difficult. The rejection from his father still stung. The idea of a future without the privileges he had grown up with was terrifying. But Marisol had always said that the most significant transformation came when you were willing to rebuild from the ground up. It was a thought that pushed him to walk through those doors, every day, with purpose. The school's focus on social justice and education had ignited something deep inside him, a desire to make a tangible difference. Jaden didn't care about business degrees or internships at tech firms anymore. He cared about people. He wanted to help. And for the first time, that thought was enough to fill the void he had spent his whole life trying to fill with empty accomplishments and hollow success. The first few weeks were hard. The culture at this school was different from what Jaden had known. There were no backroom deals, no elitist conversations about the latest stock trends. The students here were passionate about their causes, driven by ideas rather than money. They didn't care who his father was, and honestly, Jaden liked it that way. But while he felt a sense of belonging in these classrooms, the financial strain quickly began to show. Without his father's funding, Jaden found himself working long hours at a cafe, barely scraping by. Some nights, he would sit at his cramped desk, staring at the stack of bills that kept piling up. It was a stark contrast to his old life, where his credit card bill was just a number he didn't have to think twice about. Still, every time he thought about giving up or going back to his old ways, Marisol's words echoed in his mind. The road to fulfillment is rarely smooth, Jaden, but it's the one that leads to something real. The struggle wasn't just financial. He had been accustomed to the luxury of instant gratification, getting what he wanted when he wanted. But here, in this new world, success was measured differently. It wasn't about wealth or status. It was about effort, patience, and the impact you had on those around you. And Jaden was learning that lesson, the hard way. One afternoon, while sitting in a quiet corner of the library, Jaden received an email that changed everything. It was an invitation to join a mentorship program that worked with at-risk youth in the local community. The program focused on providing education and life skills to children who had been overlooked by society. The opportunity hit Jaden like a lightning bolt. This was exactly what he needed. He immediately replied, expressing his interest. A few days later, he found himself sitting in a circle of passionate individuals who shared his vision. They were students, community leaders, and professionals, all working together to create a sustainable program that would uplift the most vulnerable in their city. Jaden felt an immediate connection. For the first time, he wasn't just someone walking through life aimlessly. He had a purpose. The group's first project was to set up a series of mentorship workshops in local schools. Jaden's role was to lead discussions on the importance of education and the power of self-belief. At first, he was nervous. Speaking in front of kids was nothing like presenting at a business event, and he had no idea what to expect. But when he walked into that classroom with a group of eager faces looking up at him, he realized that this was what he had been searching for. Over the next few weeks, Jaden worked tirelessly with the children. He helped them with their homework, talked to them about their dreams, and encouraged them to believe that they were capable of more than society had led them to believe. It wasn't easy. Some of the kids were reluctant to trust him at first. They had been failed by the system before, and now here was this young man who clearly didn't understand their struggles, trying to offer advice. But slowly, Jaden began to break through. He didn't try to offer them grand solutions or pretend to have all the answers. He just listened. He shared his own struggles, how he had once been lost, how he had failed over and over again, and how he was still trying to figure it all out. And bit by bit, the walls began to come down. One particular afternoon, Jaden was sitting with a young boy named Malik, who had been particularly withdrawn. He wasn't as quick to engage, his face often clouded with anger or uncertainty. Jaden had been working with him on his reading skills, and as they sat in the library together, Jaden noticed Malik staring at the pages in frustration. "What's on your mind, Malik?" Jaden asked gently. "I don't get it. I try so hard, but it's like the words don't make sense," Malik said, his voice low, tinged with frustration. Jaden paused, then gently took the book from Malik's hands and sat beside him. "I get it," he said. "I used to feel the same way. But the thing is, reading, or anything really, isn't about being perfect from the start. It's about pushing through those hard moments, even when it feels like you're failing." Malik looked at him skeptically. "And then what?" "Then you keep going," Jaden said, leaning in a little closer. "Because when you stop, that's when you really fail. But when you keep going, even when you're not sure if it's going to work, that's when you win." Malik was quiet for a moment, the weight of Jaden's words sinking in. Then he nodded and picked the book back up. "I'll try again." And that was all it took. The smallest breakthrough. The quiet moment of understanding. Jaden's heart swelled with pride as he watched Malik's progress over the following weeks. The boy was still quiet, but his confidence was growing. He no longer saw school as an enemy to be fought. He started to understand the value of small victories, just as Jaden had learned over the past few months. There were still setbacks, financially, emotionally, and mentally. But Jaden was beginning to understand something he hadn't before. The true reward didn't come from making a deal or impressing others. It came from seeing the positive impact he could make in someone else's life. Late one evening, as Jaden sat at his desk in his small apartment, a message came through on his phone. It was an email from his old college, the one his father had wanted him to attend. He had submitted an application there just before leaving the family's business behind, mostly to appease his father. The acceptance letter sat in his inbox, waiting to be opened. Jaden stared at it for a long moment. He had been accepted into the program, but the thought of returning to his father's world made his stomach churn. He had worked so hard to distance himself from that life. He hit delete. And then, for the first time, he smiled. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in his life, Jaden knew that it was his to shape. Not dictated by a trust fund or a family name, but by his own hands. And that, he realized, was worth far more than anything money could buy. Jaden's journey was far from over, but he had taken the first steps. He had built something real, something that mattered. And as he continued to work with the youth in his program, he felt a growing sense of fulfillment. This was the life he had been searching for, the life where he could truly make a difference. For the first time, Jaden didn't just see his last name as a burden. He saw it as a tool, a means of doing something that could change the world for the better. And that was worth everything. Jaden stood backstage, the hum of voices from the audience spilling into the narrow corridor where he waited. His heart raced, but it wasn't from nerves. This time, it was from anticipation. He had worked tirelessly for this moment. The speeches, the lessons, the setbacks, and the victories had all led to this one night. A night where he would share his story, a story of transformation, of shedding the weight of his father's legacy and embracing his own path. The public speaking event was being held at the college's annual symposium, where students, faculty, and local leaders gathered to discuss important social issues. This year, the theme was personal transformation, breaking free from expectations, and Jaden's name had been selected as the keynote speaker. When he had first been asked, he almost turned it down. Speaking in front of hundreds of people, people who had watched him stumble, failed his way through life, and then suddenly turned things around, felt daunting. But Marisol's words echoed in his mind. Your story is worth sharing. Your journey has meaning. He had learned that his story wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who had ever struggled to find their way. It was a story about resilience, about growth, and about the courage to change course when life demanded it. It was a story about shedding pride and embracing vulnerability. And now, as he walked toward the stage, Jaden felt that vulnerability becomes strength. The audience was packed, their faces a blur in the dim light as Jaden made his way to the podium. The lights were blinding, and for a moment, all he could see were the shadows. But then, as he adjusted to the brightness, he began to recognize the faces in the crowd. There were students from his classes, professors, local community leaders, and, unexpectedly, his father. Marcus Thomas, sitting in the front row with a stern expression, but his eyes were focused, watching Jaden closely. Jaden's stomach clenched, but he pushed through. His father was here, and for the first time in years, Jaden wasn't afraid of what he would think. This was his moment. His father may not understand everything. But Jaden had made peace with that. His journey wasn't for Marcus, it was for him. Taking a deep breath, Jaden began. Good evening, everyone. Jaden's voice rang out, steady and clear. I'm here tonight to talk about transformation. Not the kind you read about in books or see in movies. The kind that happens when you stop pretending, when you stop being who others expect you to be, and you start becoming who you're meant to be. He paused, allowing the words to settle. There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, but Jaden focused on his message. I grew up thinking success was all about what you had, what you could buy, who you knew, and how many zeros were on your bank account. Jaden continued, his voice steady but raw. But that was a lie. I spent most of my life believing that the world owed me everything because of my last name. I lived in a bubble of wealth and privilege, disconnected from reality, and I thought that was enough. He let the silence hang for a moment before continuing. But then I failed, over and over again, and in that failure, I learned something I never expected. The true value of success isn't what you have, it's who you become. Jaden looked out at the crowd, his eyes scanning the room. His classmates, some of whom had once mocked him, were now watching intently. Even his father's gaze seemed to soften, though it was hard to read. It took me a long time to understand this, Jaden said, his voice quieter now. I spent years running from the person I really was. I used to believe that if I just played the game, if I just followed the path laid out for me, everything would be fine. But the more I tried to please others, the more empty I felt. His gaze shifted briefly to the side, where he could see Marisol sitting among the audience. She was the reason he was standing here now. The woman who had taught him the value of humility, of learning not from success, but from failure. She had shown him that wisdom wasn't something you were born with. It was something you earned through life's struggles. I had the privilege of growing up with everything anyone could ever want, Jaden continued. But I still didn't have purpose. And that's where I went wrong. I thought that success was all about achieving external milestones, grades, titles, wealth. But the truth is, success is about transformation. It's about looking at who you are, facing your flaws, and finding the courage to change. Jaden's heart beat faster as he spoke, his words growing more confident. He was no longer the arrogant young man who had relied on his father's empire to carve out a future. He was Jaden Thomas, a man who had finally found his own path. "I want to thank someone who changed everything for me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Her name is Marisol. She's not a professor. She's not a business mogul. She's a maid who works here at the school. But she taught me something more valuable than anything I learned in a classroom. She taught me that success isn't measured by the things you accumulate. It's measured by the person you become when you're willing to start over, when you're willing to leave your pride at the door and face your weaknesses." Jaden turned and nodded in Marisol's direction. The audience followed his gaze, some people clearly surprised to see her there. Marisol met his eyes with a calm smile. Her expression filled with quiet pride. "Marisol taught me the most important lesson of all," Jaden said. "She taught me that failure isn't something to be feared. It's something to embrace. Because it's through our mistakes, through the things we get wrong, that we truly learn." The room was silent for a moment, and then the applause began. At first, it was tentative, unsure, but as Jaden stood there, his chest swelling with emotion, the applause grew louder. For the first time, he wasn't doing it for anyone else. He wasn't standing on that stage because his father had told him to. He was there because he had found his own voice. As Jaden finished his speech, he stepped away from the podium, feeling lighter than he had in years. The weight of his father's expectations had been lifted. For the first time, he had spoken for himself, not as the heir to Marcus Thomas's fortune, but as Jaden, someone who had learned to embrace his true self. After the event, Jaden found his father waiting for him in the back hallway. There was no fanfare, no words of praise. But as Jaden approached, Marcus took a long look at his son, his face hard, but not as cold as it once had been. "I didn't expect you to speak like that," Marcus said, his voice gruff. Jaden smiled, his chest still full of the exhilaration of his speech. "I didn't expect to speak like that either," he replied. "But I needed to." Marcus nodded slowly, then met his eyes. "I don't fully understand what you're doing, Jaden, but I can see you're serious about it. And that's something." Jaden's heart softened at his father's words. It wasn't much, but it was progress. They didn't need to fully understand each other. But for the first time in years, Jaden saw something in his father's eyes. Respect. "I'm not walking away from everything, Dad," Jaden said, his voice calm. "But I'm not following the path you laid out for me anymore. I'm making my own way." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. "I don't know where you're going with this, Jaden, but I'm not going to stand in your way." Jaden smiled. "Thanks, Dad. That means more than you know." That night, as Jaden lay in bed, the weight of the day settled on him. He had shared his story. He had spoken his truth. He had let go of the need to impress anyone. And now, for the first time in his life, he was truly free. As he closed his eyes, he thought about Marisol, about the wisdom she had shared with him. She had shown him that success wasn't about what you had. It was about who you became. And he had become someone worth remembering. Jaden had finally found his purpose, and that, he realized, was more than enough.